If you could rate Africa's democratic processes now that we're seeing many more elections coming up, what would you give us as a rating?
Well, Larata, to be honest, it's quite difficult to rate African elections because of the very specific country context. And I would say if you look at elections in terms of quantity and quality, Africa would be rated highly on quantity because electoral contestation has now become the norm in Africa, something that wasn't the case about a decade ago. The problem that we have now is the quality of these elections, and that's where the ranking would be very difficult because we have very few success cases where elections have actually translated into regime change.
We've just had a conversation with the Archbishop and I asked him the question of political compromises. That seems to be the outcome of every election. Should we expect that? Should we accept that?
Well, I think political compromises are going to continue to be the case. If you look at the recent elections that have been happening, political parties are now forming coalitions in the run-up to elections, and therefore the situation where you have one party dominating, we hope, is actually going to disappear. And that's not happening just in Africa, but also in Britain recently. I think what we want to see from these elections is that the voters are happy with the outcome at the end of the day. Not like in the case of Kenya and Zimbabwe, where the compromise was really an unholy marriage.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about elections that have happened recently. Ethiopia and Burundi at the weekend. High voter turnout in Burundi. And the view is that it's a litmus test for the peace process because they've had so many years of civil war, and for the democratic process, whether or not the various militia and factions will accept the whole process of contestation. What's your view?
I think those are actually the concerns with those elections. And you know, yesterday actually, Burundi started its elections marathon, and they'll be having more elections in July and September and so on. And I think one of the positive things about these elections is that the last remaining armed Hutu rebel group has actually put down arms and decided to contest the elections. But still there is the concern that during elections, that's when other underlying issues boil over, come to the fore, and people are watching closely to see how that turns out.
In Ethiopia right now, there are allegations of electoral fraud, there are allegations of voter intimidation, and there's also the case of the opposition leader who couldn't really contest the election or campaign because she's been imprisoned for challenging the state on public platforms in the last 2 years. So there are grave concerns about that situation, and yet Ethiopia continues to receive Western aid. It's the darling, many people argue, of the international donor community, receiving in excess of $800 million per annum for what many argue is a government that's committed many human rights violations. How do we deal with that discrepancy?
Yeah, that's a huge concern, and I think Ethiopia is considered a darling simply because it's a key ally on the war on terror, and it will continue to be considered so because of its strategic location. But what we need to understand is that Western leverage doesn't really hold that much currency as it used to, because you have China now that's willing to lend billions of dollars without questioning the human rights records of countries like Ethiopia. But it's very worrying that the party of the Prime Minister has, you know, resorted to tactics of intimidation and people living in fear and killing innocent civilians.
Okay, we've also got upcoming elections in countries like Equatorial Guinea and Egypt. Egypt I'm particularly fascinated by because there's an allegation of a political dynasty forming, although the president's at pains to say that he's not grooming his son, but that is the view, is that they're suppressing the opposition so that Hosni Mubarak can pave the way for his son. We saw that happening in Togo, for instance.
Yeah, I think the issue of clinging on to power is really a setback for democracy in Africa. We've also seen that in Uganda, where you have almost what is considered a family cabinet, and that is a strategy that politicians use so that once they're out of power, that they're still protected, and it's a concern.
Okay, and just a final input from you, Chris. We've also got elections coming up in countries like Equatorial Guinea. Now, Equatorial Guinea is very much off the radar because nobody's really following events there, but everybody's now become a little bit interested in Equatorial Guinea because of the oil potential, because the new frontier for oil. Do you think that the oil issue is going to cloud people's value judgments about their democratic standards?
Yeah, look, it also came to prominence last year or earlier this year when Simon Mann, the mercenary, was released by the Equatorial Guinea people. Yeah, look, I think obviously it comes back to what we said earlier. The more and more we can actually get economic growth in Africa and coming into the hands of the people, being cascading all the way down, I think less and less you're going to have political oligarchs holding sway.